The arguments below, presented in the text, are filled with misconceptions, logical fallacies, and oversimplifications of the complex historical, economic and social realities surrounding the issue of reparations. Here's a breakdown of some of the points and whether they are correct or not. Demanding reparations for long-past damages to ancestors like those who were enslaved is stupid, moronic, short-sighted, and unwise. Response: this is a highly dismissive characterization of the reparations argument. Reparations are not just about seeking compensation for historical wrongs, they are also about addressing the long-term, intergenerational impacts of slavery and systemic racism that still affect Black communities today. Many scholars, activists, and reparations advocates see it as a necessary step toward healing and justice, particularly in addressing systemic inequities that persist. There was a limited time after the Civil War to demand reparations for freed slaves from slave owners. Response: while it is true that there was a period after the Civil War when the U.S. government had the opportunity to provide reparations, like through the Freedmen's Bureau or land redistribution such as 40 acres and a mule, the failure to act during that period does not negate the legitimacy of reparations today. The denial of reparations post-Civil War is a historical injustice that continues to have lasting effects. The Civil War wiped out utterly the wealth of 99% of the former slave owners. Response: while many slave owners did experience financial hardship as a result of the war, this doesn't mean that the wealth generated by slavery was erased. The wealth generated by enslaved people and their labor was substantial. And the economic systems that were built upon this wealth continued to benefit those who were not directly involved in slavery. Reparations are not simply about direct financial restitution. They are about addressing the enduring legacies of these systems of exploitation. Who benefited financially, property-wise, and wealth-wise from the Civil War? Wasn't it the Northerners? While the Northern states were economically stronger and generally benefited from the war, it is misleading to suggest that reparations should be demanded from them. The North's economy was built in part on the labor of enslaved people through industries like textiles, shipping, and finance. The argument about Northerners benefiting does not dismiss the responsibility of the U.S. government, corporations, and individuals who profited from slavery, and it ignores the fact that many Black Americans are still disadvantaged due to the war's aftermath. But if the source of slaves in the Americas was the African continent, why not go demand reparations from the various African nations? Response: this argument shifts blame onto African nations for the transatlantic slave trade. While it is true that some African leaders were complicit in the trade, it is inaccurate and unfair to demand reparations from African countries for their role. The real responsibility lies with European powers that orchestrated and profited from the transatlantic slave trade, as well as with the U.S. government and its institutions that perpetuated slavery and its legacy. The legacy of slavery in America is a direct consequence of U.S. policies and actions, not actions taken by African nations. Wasn't it Booker T. Washington, a former slave, who wrote about former slaves helping out their former owners who fell on hard times? Response: Washington's philosophy of self-help and accommodation to the status quo should be understood within the historical context of his time. While he advocated for self-improvement and helping those less fortunate, it doesn't negate the need for reparations or the acknowledgement of historical wrongs. Washington's advice was a practical response to a deeply segregated society, but this doesn't mean that the legacy of slavery and racial injustice should go unaddressed. What if a village has been totally destroyed by a tornado? God is guilty of this evil. Demand reparations from God. Response: this is a false analogy. Slavery was not a natural disaster but a system of human exploitation, deliberately built and maintained for economic gain. Comparing slavery and its effects to a natural disaster trivializes the human agency involved in creating and perpetuating this system. Back in the good old days, when someone could not pay their debt, said person becomes a slave to the damaged person, or a slave to the person to whom the debt is owed. Are those demanding reparations yearning for the return of slavery? Response. This is a strawman argument that distorts the intention behind reparations. Advocates for reparations are not calling for the return of slavery, but for the recognition of historical wrongs and the provision of reparative measures to address the ongoing impacts of those wrongs. The idea that reparations advocates are yearning for the return of slavery is a baseless, fear-mongering tactic. The argument against reparations in the text relies on misleading comparisons, oversimplifications of history, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the issue. Reparations are about addressing systemic inequities that persist today, which were created by the institution of slavery and its aftermath. The call for reparations is not an attack on any group of people, but a demand for justice, equity, and recognition of historical wrongs that continue to have far-reaching consequences for Black Americans. Please be sure to like and subscribe to this channel, and thank you all for your comments.